Hello again everyone, and welcome back. My name is SRO. The Metamorph Challenge League and the Conquerors of the Atlas expansion have arrived, and with them comes a dangerous new league mechanic, an overhauled endgame, and substantially more difficult boss fights from the earliest acts to the highest tiers of maps. Bosses throughout the game now deal more damage, attack faster, have increased armor and resistances, and most notably have drastically increased life pools. As a result, boss encounters have become a much more harrowing and drawn out experience. The danger of taking a powerful hit or depleting your flasks during a fight has become much more real. The Metamorph bosses also provide a consistent challenge during the acts and early mapping. But it's in the highest tiers of maps where Metamorphs can become absurd. They are often capable of one-shotting or almost instantaneously killing even moderately defensive characters. On top of that, they can have disgustingly high life pools that make an average map boss pale in comparison. But even beyond them lurks the new endgame bosses, the Elder Slayers. This league is filled to the brim with chaotic and potentially deadly boss fights. A more difficult path of Exile demands a more resilient character, and that is exactly where the Molten Strike Juggernaut comes in. It is by a considerable margin the most resilient build that I've ever played. It can dive headfirst into the most ridiculously dangerous and chaotic mapping situations imaginable and still comes out on top. It can comfortably and consistently face tank and destroy fully juiced tier 16 Metamorphs. And finally, can withstand, defeat, and often even trivialize endgame bosses, casually absorbing massive incoming attacks from Guardians and Elder Slayers alike, even making Shaper slams and beams look like they're almost nothing. We are able to accomplish this through a huge variety of defensive layers, the base of which is a life pool that can push well over 8,000 when fully optimized. Through our Juggernaut Ascendancy and our gear selections, we can stack up to 10 endurance charges and push our armor over 45,000 when everything is running optimally. We'll be utilizing both a cast when damage taken Molten Shell and a Vaal Molten Shell to take full advantage of the high amount of armor we've stacked, preventing us from taking ridiculous amounts of incoming damage. This makes us exceedingly hard to kill, as very little damage will actually slip through, and provides us with an amazing opportunity to bounce back from even the most dire of situations and recover quickly back up to full life. In almost all combat circumstances, we will have our physical reduction capped at 90%, and will also be taking 41% reduced elemental damage. We also have complete immunity to chill, freeze, stun, and even temporal chains, all through the use of Comb's roots, keeping us in the fight. We also have extremely high chaos resistance, a small amount of block chance, and a consistent fortify buff. And our final defining defensive layer is our ability to recover exceedingly quickly. We are able to regenerate over 1,500 life every second, and over 2,000 if we're standing on consecrated ground. We leech a huge chunk of both life and mana, and through our gear and our skill tree, we are able to recover life from flasks exceptionally quickly. All of this sustain, durability, and recovery allows us to traverse the game with confidence, face tanking and outlasting the majority of the combat situations in the game. Combine that with some reasonable fight knowledge, a little bit of manual dodging, and tactical use of your Vaal Molten Shell, and you will be one difficult target to take down. We'll be pairing all of this defensive capability with one of my favorite skills being Molten Strike. It is an absolutely fantastic choice here due to its ability to map very competently and still have very good single target capabilities. Fueling Molten Strike will be a pair of Nebulok Nightmare Maces, granting us huge amounts of physical damage, which we'll be converting using Avatar of Fire. The Nebuloks also grant us up to 80% of our base physical damage as extra fire damage. Molten Strike received both a buff and a nerf with 3.9. One of our biggest damage boosts, being Point Blank, was nerfed by 20%. However, Molten Strike had its base damage raised slightly, and more notably, now fires an additional projectile, as was confirmed in an AMA done by GGG. The build's damage capabilities are not god tier, but are very solid, and don't seem to have taken any hit from the recent changes. Able to map rather quickly, and very satisfyingly, but of course able to take down bosses at a very respectable pace. But the build truly prides itself on its ability to withstand just about everything the game has to offer and bounce right back, comfortably face tanking the most devastating attacks, facing down the strongest bosses, and pushing its way into the deepest endgame. And with that covered, let's jump into just how to make this build happen. And this time around, we're going to be doing things a little bit differently, beginning first with our skill tree. In the provided Path of Building link, you will be able to find a leveling, mid-game, and end-game skill tree, which you can change like this. Offensively, our tree is focused on scaling elemental damage, attack damage, elemental resistance penetration, and attack speed, with our main keystone pickups being Iron Grip to increase our projectile damage, Point Blank to also increase our projectile damage, and Elemental Overload, causing us to deal 40% more elemental damage with both the Molten Strike hit and Molten Strike's projectiles if we've hit a critical strike in the last 8 seconds. Defensively, the tree focuses on a few key things. The first of which is going to be getting every endurance charge we can get our hands on, as well as stacking as much life from the tree as possible. We'll be hitting about 220% increased maximum life from just the tree alone. We'll also be picking up life and mana leech, stacking up as much armor as conveniently possible, getting additional life regeneration from multiple nodes, and finally shoring up a chunk of our elemental resistances, and increasing the maximum of those resistances at the same time by picking up a few low investment nodes. We'll also be getting a little bit of utility by picking up 4 different jewel sockets for as little investment as possible. All of this encapsulating what we're looking to do when we're building up the skill tree. A little bit later on in the video, we'll be discussing the kind of jewels you want to be looking for and going into greater detail about what you'll want to be prioritizing during every stage of the leveling process. Links for every section of the build guide are available in the description and in the pinned comment for mobile users. Now that we've taken an overview look at the skill tree and its primary goals, let's discuss the powerful Juggernaut Ascendancy that fuels the build. Almost every node is going to be defensively focused. However, the exception in this build is going to be Undeniable, which primarily grants us a gigantic and much needed boost to our accuracy rating. This one node alone essentially shoring up all of our accuracy issues and raising our chance to hit up to 100%. It also grants us a smaller boost to our attack speed and damage, making this a really nice node to pick up early on. Next up is going to be the node Unbreakable, which provides us with a very versatile array of defensive benefits. More life regeneration, reduced damage taken, a big boost to the armor that we receive directly from our chest piece, and additional life regeneration based upon the amount of physical damage that we've taken in the last 10 seconds. Just a truly solid defensive node that reduces the damage we take and improves our ability to recover without having to do anything actively, allowing us to remain in the fight and sustain our life pool. Next up is going to be the node Unflinching. This is our endurance charge generator, providing us with an endurance charge 30% of the time when we get hit. Once we've been hit, we will gain an endurance charge every second for the next 4 seconds. And finally, there's a 25% chance that if we were to gain an endurance charge in any capacity, that we would instantly gain up to our maximum level of endurance charges. And alongside all of this endurance charge generation, it grants us 1 additional maximum endurance charge. This one node alone essentially guaranteeing that we will have our maximum endurance charges in all combat situations, even against bosses. It's possible to have moments of downtime, but they are very, very uncommon. If you find yourself in that spot, it means that you haven't been hit by anything for at least 18 seconds. Normally, that's a pretty good problem to have, so you're probably doing just fine. For our final node, we have Unrelenting. Due to the amount of endurance charges and armor that we have, the additional physical damage reduction doesn't really do anything for us. However, the reduced elemental damage taken is always nice to have in the build. And combining the chaos resistance that we get here with what we get from our Nebulox, we end up at around 48%, heavily reducing the amount of chaos damage that we take. The order in which you take these ascendancies is pretty flexible. However, I would recommend starting with Undeniable. The increase to our accuracy rating, attack speed, and damage is very nice to have during the early leveling. For our second ascendancy, the choice is obviously between Unflinching and Unbreakable. Unbreakable is great standalone and doesn't require any investment into endurance charges to get all of the benefit out of having it. However, if you're reaching that mid-game second ascendancy and you've already gotten a few endurance charges picked up or you have the points available, it's worth considering picking up Unflinching right away. Whichever one you don't get, you'll want to make your third ascendancy, which leaves us with Unrelenting as the final piece of the ascendancy puzzle. The Juggernaut Ascendancy has continued to impress me and is without a doubt one of the best choices for such a difficult and boss-filled league. Moving right along, let's quickly talk about the Bandit selection. None of the choices are impressive to me in any meaningful way. I would rather have the 2 passive points than any of the benefits that they would grant us individually. Thus, my top recommendation is to put each of them out of their misery and collect your 2 passive points from Aramir. Up next, let's talk about the top Pantheon choices that are available for this build. Regardless of the souls that you select, be sure to capture all of the additional souls to maximize the benefit you gain from the Pantheons. We'll be starting first with the Major God, with my pick being torn between Soul of Lunaris and Soul of Solaris. Lunaris is focused more on giving us additional chance to avoid projectiles and dodge attacks and spells, helping us mitigate some damage by simply avoiding it completely. On the other hand, Solaris is focused on reducing the amount of damage that we take situationally, most notably giving us immunity to critical strike damage for 4 seconds if we've taken a critical strike recently. This helps us avoid situations in which we get bursted down extremely quickly. Both options are extremely solid and you really can't go wrong either way. Moving on to the Minor God, with my top recommendation being Soul of Rislatha. This build is heavily focused on outlasting our opponents, and it does so well. Part of that success stems from the ability to regenerate our life flasks actively. If you end up depleting all of your life flasks during an extended fight, having this Pantheon can make all the difference in the world. You can temporarily lean on your life regeneration and leech capabilities to allow some charges to accumulate, keeping you in the fight. This soul even increases the amount of life that you recover from flasks when you use them in a dire situation when on low life. This is truly just a fantastic Pantheon and an easy recommendation. As a swap-in, I do recommend capturing the additional soul for Soul of Shikari. This will grant you complete immunity to poison, which is really nice to have when going against the new Hunter Elder Slayer. This makes the fight substantially easier and is well worth having when you specifically are fighting him or another poison-based boss. With that covered, it's time for us to move into the skills and links of the build. And we'll begin, of course, with our main Molten Strike setup, which we'll be linking first to elemental damage with attacks, with this gem granting us one of our biggest DPS boosts to both Molten Strike's melee hit and projectiles. It is an absolute must-have as it comes with no downsides whatsoever. For the third link, we'll be utilizing Elemental Focus to give us another huge damage boost to both Molten Strike's melee hit and projectiles. However, this one does come at a cost, preventing Molten Strike from inflicting any sort of elemental ailments on our enemies, most notably removing the chance to ignite them. However, it is well worth it for the damage boost that it provides. Our fourth link, Concentrated Effect, is going to be quite similar. Both the damage boost and the downside that come with it will only affect our projectiles and not the melee hit itself. But the damage boost it provides for our projectiles is exceedingly substantial, but it comes at the cost of substantially reduced area of effect. However, due to the way that Molten Strike functions, this is not a huge downside, especially for single target, although it can slow down mapping speed very slightly. Moving along to the fifth link, we'll be utilizing Multi-Strike. This causes Molten Strike to repeat 2 additional times, allows us to attack drastically faster, and despite lowering our damage very slightly, actually deals more damage on repeated uses of the skill. Multi-Strike is incredibly valuable to the build. It makes the build as a whole a lot more dynamic and satisfying to play. And finally, for our sixth link, we have a few different options. I personally like to go with Inspiration Support, even after the small nerf it saw with the arrival of 3.9. It provides a nice damage boost to both the melee hit and projectiles, and increases our critical strike chance, which plays a role in helping us keep elemental overload up more frequently. With just these 2 benefits, it's already a really solid support, but it goes even further, lowering the mana cost of Molten Strike by up to 34% at level 20. Taking Molten Strike from costing around 24 mana down to 18. It may not seem like a meaningful difference, but it really does add up when we're attacking quite quickly. In my experience, it did play a big role in keeping my mana sustain going. However, there are some other good options, being Fire Penetration Support and Endurance Charge on melee stun. They both provide a relatively similar DPS boost to what Inspiration is already giving us. Fire Penetration is worth considering if you're mostly just farming bosses, and Endurance Charge on melee stun is most worth it if you can actually stack up to a full 10 Endurance Charges. Beyond that, it is probably better to be running Inspiration Support in my opinion. With that being said, let's move into the auras that drive the build. First up, we have Blood and Sand, which we'll be using specifically in Blood Stance, granting our projectiles 15% more area damage, and at the cost of only 10% of our mana, this aura is well worth it. Next, we're going to be using Anger, which provides us with a pretty sizable amount of added fire damage to our attacks, but it comes at the cost of 50% of our mana. Certainly worth having in the build, but it does not come cheap. And finally, we're going to be utilizing Herald of Purity. You may be asking, why not run Herald of Ash? Herald of Purity actually provides us with more damage, giving us a nice chunk of physical damage to attacks that we convert completely into fire damage. As an additional bonus, it summons some minions that help us out in combat. Their influence is very minor, but helpful nonetheless. Forging on, let's take a look at our movement skill setup. With this build, we'll be utilizing Leap Slam to traverse the map quickly. linking it first to faster attacks, which not only makes it trigger faster, but just feels so much smoother in general. From there, we'll be linking it to Fortify support, which grants us with the buff Fortify whenever we hit anything with Leap Slam, be it a boss or any random enemy. Leap Slam has a fair amount of AoE, making this quite the easy task. With this setup, Fortify should be up almost constantly while mapping, and very often against bosses if you're timing it correctly. And for our final link, we'll be utilizing Molten Strike. This gem allowing Leap Slam to instantly kill anything it hits that is below 10% life. This also includes bosses, meaning that if you can get a boss whittled down, just Leap Slam into their face and they will instantly die. It's a really nice piece of utility to have in the build. Moving along, let's talk about 3 independent utility gems that help the build in various ways. First up, we have Blood Rage, which grants us a little bit of inherent attack speed, as well as allowing us to generate frenzy charges 25% of the time when we kill an enemy. We can have up to a total of 3. These charges will be up basically non-stop while mapping, making Blood Rage very beneficial to keep going and well worth having in the build. It does, however, come at a cost, causing us to take 4% of our total maximum life per second as physical damage. The impact it actually has, however, is extremely negligible, as we already regenerate a ton of life and almost constantly have capped physical damage reduction, making Blood Rage well worth having. Our second utility gem is going to be Ancestral Protector, which is a totem skill that we can manually cast whenever we want to have access to its buff, which will grant us 20% more attack speed. This is a pretty staggering DPS boost for basically no cost whatsoever. You'll simply have to cast it every so often while mapping and against bosses if you want to gain access to that bonus speed. For our third utility skill, we have a few different options. First up, we have Precision, which you'll want to be running at around level 1. This is a small additional aura that can be run if you can spare the mana. It is far from integral to have in the build, but the bonus critical strike chance helps ensure that we have elemental overload up more consistently. Alternatively, you can run Vaal Haste or Vaal Grace, not the aura portion, merely the Vaal portion of the skill, with Vaal Haste giving us a nice movement and attack speed bonus for a short time, and Vaal Grace improving our chance to dodge both attack and spell hits for a short duration as well. And finally, if you just want pure convenience, you could choose to run the Portal gem here, allowing you to forego the use of portal scrolls forevermore. And with that, we arrive at our final gem setup, which will be our Cast When Damage Taken. This is a gem that will automatically cast linked spells when we take damage that hits a certain threshold that scales with the gem's level. Keep in mind that any gem that you want to be triggered by Cast When Damage Taken has to have a required level that is equivalent to or lower than the required level of Cast When Damage Taken itself. Linked to Cast When Damage Taken is going to be the Curse Flammability. Any enemies cursed by this will have a huge amount of fire resistance taken away, which increases the amount of fire damage they will take from our attacks. Also attached to Cast When Damage Taken is going to be Vaal Molten Shell. Cast When Damage Taken support will only automatically trigger the regular Molten Shell portion of the skill. With most of our endgame gear and our endurance charges up, this will automatically grant you a buff between 7,000 and 9,000. For the duration of its effect, this is essentially extra life that we can utilize. 75% of the damage we would have taken will be taken from the buff instead. It also deals reflected damage back to the enemies based on how much damage it absorbed. We'll also have access to the manual cast of Vaal Molten Shell, which is basically just a souped up version of Molten Shell itself. Once again, with our endgame gear and charges up, the Vaal Molten Shell buff can be as high as around 27,000. The buff also absorbs 80% of the damage we would have taken, and reflects damage back to attackers every second. We'll be combining all 3 of these links to an increased duration support. This causes our curse to remain on enemies longer and increases the duration of both our Molten Shell and Vaal Molten Shell. With the full setup, the automatic cast of Molten Shell can last around 5 seconds, with the Vaal Molten Shell lasting around 15. I cannot overstate the incredible benefits that Molten Shell in both of its forms provides to the build. The automatic cast preventing a metric ton of damage in all mapping and bossing situations. In the Vaal Molten Shell, coming in at key moments, saving you from death, preventing an unbelievable amount of damage, and giving you the time you need to recover and bounce back up to full life. It is important to note that you optimally want to be casting Vaal Molten Shell during a time when the automatic cast of Molten Shell is either in effect or is in its 4-second cooldown following the depletion of its buff. If you do so, based upon my testing, Vaal Molten Shell will not be interrupted by the automatic cast of Molten Shell, and will be allowed to persist for its entire 15-second duration. However, if Vaal Molten Shell is cast when Molten Shell is not in cooldown or active, It will be replaced by the weaker automatic cast of regular Molten Shell when you take enough damage to trigger the cast when damage taken gem. Thus, when timed perfectly, you can get the 5 seconds of regular Molten Shell activation, and then right as the buff is about to deplete or soon after it depletes, you can activate Vaal Molten Shell, giving you another 15 seconds. This combined will grant you 20 seconds of a broken level of damage mitigation, and is the optimal way to utilize the setup. However, Vaal Molten Shell is also quite useful as a simple panic button, regardless of the status of Molten Shell itself. Even if Vaal Molten Shell only lasts for a few seconds and gets replaced by regular Molten Shell, it still provided you with an on-demand I want to take 80% reduced damage button. And in the worst case scenario, it is simply replaced by a slightly weaker version of itself. From my perspective, there are basically no downsides here, and properly utilizing both the automatic Molten Shell and manual cast of Vaal Molten Shell can, at least for a time, make you practically invincible. The only thing left to decide is what levels to have this set up at. My personal recommendation is to have cast when damage taken at level 1. The gem at that level requires you to be at level 38, meaning that your Vaal Molten Shell can be at level 10 and your Flammability Curse can be at level 5. This specific setup is tuned to have cast when damage taken triggering as often as possible, cursing nearby enemies much more often and causing Molten Shell to trigger slightly more frequently. I found success doing this because I wanted to have as much Molten Shell coverage and as many enemies and bosses cursed as possible. However, you can set this up in any way you like. If you want to gain a little bit more armor or reflect more damage with Molten Shell, or reduce our enemies' fire resistance further with flammability, you can certainly level these gems up a little bit more just to eke that bit of value out. However, the higher you level them, the higher the level that cast when damage taken will have to be. This causes the damage threshold needed to trigger cast when damage taken to skyrocket, meaning that the higher the level that cast when damage taken is at, the less often it will trigger, providing you in turn with reduced coverage. Thus, I recommend having this setup at these specific levels, but you can customize this however you like. Before we move along, a quick note about awakened support gems. They have thus far proven to be quite expensive, but if you have the money to burn, of course, look to replace any of the skill gems we have in the build with their awakened versions, as they essentially do the same thing, just a little bit better. And with that, the gems have been wrapped up. I think it's finally time for us to discuss the build's gear choices. In the path of building, I will be providing multiple gear sets for use at different stages of the game, which you can easily swap out just like this. When discussing the cost of an individual item, I will be using broad tiers of price rather than a direct amount, those tiers being cheap 0 to 20 chaos, moderate 21 to 100 chaos, and expensive anything over 100 chaos in price. I do this because Path of Exile has a player-driven economy, with prices being completely at the mercy of supply and demand. Thus, all prices listed in the video are subject to change and may or may not see some major shift following the release of this video or in future leagues. With that out of the way, let's begin with our first piece of gear, and that is our endgame weapon selection. We're going to be dual wielding a pair of Nebulok Nightmare Maces, and fortunately for us, they are very affordable, with a price tag on the very low end of moderate. At its base, it grants us a solid amount of physical damage and up to 40% of our physical attack damage as extra fire. That's already quite good, but the real strength of the weapon comes from stacking endurance charges. In this build, at its peak, we'll have around 10 charges, which means that, combined, our Nebuloks can grant us up to 80% to our chaos resistance, up to a full 20% reduced elemental damage taken, adds an additional 100 to 160 physical damage to our attacks combined, and finally can grant us up to 10,000 base armor. Truly incredible, both offensively and defensively, heavily reducing the amount of chaos and elemental damage that we take, and providing us with the majority of our base armor. They do, however, come with a downside, causing us to take up to 4,000 fire damage per second with our endurance charges at their maximum, but only if we've been hit in the last 4 seconds. This sounds much worse than it is, with the amount of damage we actually take being significantly lower due to our fire resistance and our heavily reduced elemental damage taken. We're also constantly regenerating a huge amount of life, far more than the Nebuloks actually deal to us. Furthermore, choosing to dual wield grants us the following inherent bonuses: 10% more attack speed, 20% more attack physical damage, and 15% chance to block. The Nebuloks are so good they are practically build defining, and I couldn't recommend them more. Moving along to our endgame helmet selection, which is going to ideally be a rare helmet with a strong armor base. These are the key stats we're going to be looking for: high amounts of life, resistances, and attributes, as well as additional armor, and the stat: nearby enemies have -X% to their fire resistance. The additional reduction to enemy resistances is really nice to have offensively and is worth the money if you can pick it up. A rare helmet like this is going to be quite flexible in price, but is going to be heavily dependent on the helmet enchantment that we need for the build. Molten Strike has a defining enchantment that boosts both its single target and clear speed capabilities. That enchantment being Molten Strike fires up to 2 additional projectiles. Currently, there is a very solid amount of selection in the moderate price category for this enchantment. However, helmet enchantment prices can shift very quickly and unpredictably and may see some change in the near future. Alternatively, there is a weaker version of the helmet enchantment that offers just a single additional projectile but is available in bulk for very cheap. Pick up the best helmet that fits within your budget and has one of these 2 enchantments. Continuing down the list to our body armor selection, for which I have several unique options that all provide different types of benefits to the build. First is going to be a Belly of the Beast. It grants us some armor and resistances, but most notably, it increases our maximum life by up to 40%. It makes our life flasks recover drastically quicker. Truly solid all around and gives us one of our biggest possible boosts to our maximum life total. It is available unlinked for very cheap, 5-linked for moderate expense, and 6-linked for an expensive cost. Alternatively, we have Spore Guard, which grants us a huge chunk of armor, a much smaller amount of increased maximum life, and a bit of chaos resistance as well. Its main benefit creates fungal ground underneath us when we stop moving or when we kill an enemy. Any enemy standing on fungal ground will deal 10% less damage to us. It does, however, have a higher barrier of entry in terms of cost, and is expensive unlinked, 5-linked, and 6-linked compared to Belly of the Beast. An additional alternative exists in the form of a rare chest piece. If you go this route, you're really going to want to make sure it has an armor base, and ideally would be an astral plate. You'll be looking for the following stats: high amounts of life, resistances, attributes, and armor. You can find a huge amount of extremely high life chest pieces, many that even have high resistances as well, for very cheap. These will typically come unlinked, but are one of the most cost-effective routes you can go. And if you have the funds, you can look for the very expensive New Crusader stat. Killed enemies explode, dealing 3% of their life as physical damage, which in a very similar style to Spore Guard will heavily improve your clear speed. Whether you go for Belly, Spore Guard, a rare chest piece, or even an alternative that I hadn't considered, you can utilize Jeweler's Touch, a very cheap prophecy that will give you an instant 5-link with the usage of a single Jeweler's Orb, instantly turning your chest piece into something usable and getting you mapping faster. You could also temporarily use a Tabula Rasa for a very cheap 6-link. Alternatively, farm for a Tabula Rasa by collecting its divination card in the Act 9 zone, the Blood Aqueducts. And as a final option, you can utilize these search parameters on pathofexile.com/trade. This will provide you with an array of cheap corrupted 6-links available for purchase. And with that covered, let's discuss our glove selection. We're going to be utilizing a rare glove. Ideally one that of course has an armor base, looking for as much life, resistances, attributes, and armor as possible. Additionally, offensive stats like attack speed, added physical damage, or added fire damage to attacks are all helpful as well. However, our true objective is to pick up gloves that have the new Hunter stat. Strike skills target 1 additional nearby enemy. Some of you may have noticed that we didn't have Ancestral Call in our Molten Strike 6-link. We can essentially gain its effect for free by having the stat on our gloves and optionally anointing our amulet with Tribal Fury. This completely removes the need to have Ancestral Call and frees up space to socket a ton of additional damage into the build. With that said, let's hop right into the boots. And here we've got the easy choice of Combs Roots, offering us up to 200 maximum life and preventing us from feeling the negative effects of chill, freeze, stun, knockback, and temporal chains. Impeccably strong, perfect for the build, and even well-rolled examples are available for very cheap. I can't recommend these highly enough. As you're looking to optimize the build, or if you have enough funds, look to pick up a version that is corrupted to have the implicit +1 to maximum endurance charges. Many aspects of the build scale off of our endurance charges, so increasing the maximum amount we can have is huge, but will make the boots very expensive. When you're on a lower budget, it's best to pick up a cheap, well-rolled Combs Roots and focus on getting a good boot enchantment, which you can farm quite easily by yourself, with our best options being adds up to 45 to 68 fire damage if you've killed recently, up to 16% increased attack and cast speed if you've killed recently, damage penetrates up to 10% of enemies' elemental resistances if you haven't killed recently, and finally up to 120% increased critical strike chance if you haven't crit recently, with my top recommendation being the increased critical strike chance if you haven't crit recently, with this single stat allowing us to have elemental overload up much more consistently, heavily reducing the need to have critical strike chance in other places in the build. However, if you already have enough critical strike chance, any of these options will serve the build just fine. Proceeding now onto the Amulet selection, the exceedingly powerful Zoph's Blood, which defensively grants us a huge amount of strength, percentage increase to maximum life, and fire resistance. Offensively, it allows our damage to penetrate 10% of the enemy's fire resistance and covers any enemy that hits us in ash, slowing down their movement speed and causing them to take substantially increased fire damage. And if all of that wasn't enough, it also grants us Avatar of Fire, saving us the 3 skill points we would have had to spend picking it up ourselves, with Avatar of Fire converting 50% of the physical, cold, and lightning damage we do into fire damage, and causing us to deal no direct non-fire damage, giving us one final huge DPS boost. Zoph's Blood is really good in this build and comes highly recommended. It is currently somewhat expensive, but quite attainable. Ideally pick up one that is uncorrupted so that we can anoint it. Until you can afford one, running a rare amulet like this one, with plenty of life, resistances, and relevant offensive stats will serve you just fine. Once you've got your Zoph's Blood, we're going to want to anoint it as soon as possible, and there are a few really solid options. The first school of thought is just simply increasing our DPS, in which case picking up Galvanic Hammer for a clear, a sepia, and a crimson, pretty cheap, you'll gain around 10% increased DPS. You could also look to pick up Primeval Force for an azure, a violet, and a silver, moderate expense. You'll be gaining around a 12% DPS boost. And finally, for those with deep pockets, Tenacity is a great choice. For a golden, and a crimson, you can gain 5% increased maximum life, as well as about a 15% DPS boost. The second school of thought is improving our clear speed capabilities by picking up Tribal Fury. For a golden, a silver, and an opalescent, firmly in the expensive category, you can target one additional enemy with Molten Strike, causing each additional swing to send out a huge amount of additional projectiles, drastically improving your performance against packs. For those looking to map faster and map quite a bit, this is going to be the best anointment for you, bar none. Finally, the third school of thought is improving our maximum life and our defensive capabilities. 2 really good options will be Herbalism for a silver, an opalescent, and a teal, and Profane Chemistry for a silver, a black, and a verdant. Both of these are of moderate cost, increase our life pool, and increase the potency of our flasks. Every anointment that I've listed here will serve the build well, so give some consideration to what direction you want to go with the anointment. Forging onward to our ring selection, which ideally is going to be 2 Combs Way, being of moderate expense, with each one granting us a chunk of life and strength and giving us an additional maximum endurance charge, which gives us a really nice boost to both our offensive and defensive capabilities. Each Combs Away also allows us to regenerate up to 4% of our maximum life per second if our endurance charges are up. If you can get your resistances figured out, you're going to want to be running 2 of these. However, if you're having trouble doing so, the build will not suffer much from dropping a Combs Way temporarily to pick up a rare ring, ideally one that has a big chunk of life and an absolute ton of resistances. In fact, I did this for the entirety of the footage that you saw at the beginning of the video. I was only running 1 Combs Way. Having just that one rare ring can cover such a huge amount of your resistance needs, making it much easier to get your enchanted helmet and your pair of strike an additional enemy gloves, simply because those items can then have much lower resistances, making them cheaper and more widely available. However, the true endgame optimized goal remains running 2 Combs Way. And that finally brings us to our belt selection. Ideally, you'll be looking for a leather or a Stygian base with the following key stats: as much life, resistances, and attributes as possible, and offensively looking for increased fire damage, increased elemental damage, and increased elemental damage with attacks. Belts like these ultimately have a very flexible price and can fit your budget, with leather belts typically being a fair bit cheaper than their Stygian counterparts. If you do pick up a Stygian vise, you will have a single available Abyssal Jewel socket, in which case I would recommend picking up an Abyssal Jewel that has as much life as possible, increased attack speed, added physical or fire damage, and increased resistances or attributes if needed. And with that, the core gear is completely wrapped up, and it's time for us to discuss the Flasks. First up is going to be the Wise Oak, a powerful offensive and defensive flask that is available for very cheap. When using Wise Oak, you'll want to make sure that your uncapped fire, cold, and lightning resistances are completely equal to each other. If they are, the flask considers each of them to be both the highest and lowest uncapped elemental resistance simultaneously, meaning that when the flask is active, you'll take 10% reduced fire, cold, and lightning damage, and your damage will penetrate up to 15% of fire, cold, and lightning resistance, making this flask both a powerful and versatile option. Next up is going to be the moderately priced Cinder Swallow Urn Silver Flask, with this flask granting us Onslaught on use and allowing us to recover up to 3% of our life, mana, and energy shield whenever we kill an enemy during the flask effect. We also have access to one additional crafted mod, with the two best options being regenerate 3% of life during flask effect and 60 to 80% increased critical strike chance during flask effect. If you're in need of additional critical strike chance to keep elemental overload up, this is a great place to get it. And if you don't, the extra life regeneration is always a good choice. Advancing on to our third flask, which is going to be a life flask, specifically an eternal or divine life flask. The prefix is completely up to you. I personally find success with the 50% increased recovery rate. The suffix, however, should either be of staunching, giving us immunity to bleeding, or of warding, giving us immunity to curses. Whichever suffix you don't cover on the life flask, you'll want to be covering with our fourth flask, which is a sulfur flask, which grants us a flat 40% increased damage and creates consecrated ground underneath us. This heavily incentivizes us to use the flask right next to bosses, so that we can stand our ground and gain the benefits that consecrated ground provides us, causing us to regenerate 6% of our maximum life per second, and making it more likely for us to hit critical strikes against affected enemies. And again, the prefix here is very flexible, so go with whatever you can find for cheap or whatever serves your build best. And finally, for the fifth slot, we have a few solid options. Defensively, we can pick up a Rumi's Concoction for quite cheap. This flask granting us a gigantic amount of armor and up to an additional 20% chance to block and 10% chance to block spells. I love utilizing this flask and it's a great choice all around. Alternatively, you could choose to go for the expensive Dying Sun flask, with this flask granting us a huge amount of fire resistance, causing us to take 20% less fire damage, and giving Molten Strike 2 additional projectiles. The overall boost to both our single target and clear speed is fairly substantial, and is a very powerful option for the build, with the only major downside being that Dying Sun doesn't work that well with Wise Oak, making your resistance balancing more of a challenge. And with that, we arrive at one of our final stops, the jewels. First and foremost, we have the Wildfire Crimson Jewel, which is a unique jewel that specifically affects Molten Strike and basically provides it with exactly Dying Sun's effect, giving Molten Strike 2 additional projectiles and some increased area of effect. You can only have one of these in your build, but it is well worth having. You can pick it up for cheap, or it can be found through the story in Act 5 after completing the quest Death to Purity. We also have a few spots available for rare jewels. Here are the stats to look for. Absolute top priority is getting percentage increased maximum life on each of your jewels. From there, you can look for multiple varieties of attack speed, as well as extra resistances and attributes that you still need. And that brings us to the optional Watcher's Eye. I did not have one during the gameplay footage, but it comes recommended if they are available and affordable. If you do go to pick one up, look for the following anger or precision based stats. All of these will end up serving the build in a relatively similar capacity, so pick up whatever you can find at a good price. And with that being said, the gear is 100% wrapped up, and all that remains is how to best level the build. First, we'll discuss my advice about the leveling tree. I highly recommend taking full advantage of the early, mid, and endgame skill trees that I provided in the path of building. They should give you a very solid idea of what nodes you want to be prioritizing at the various stages in the leveling process. In the early leveling, we'll be picking up a lot of life and damage based nodes. We'll also be getting this jewel socket early on to socket in Wildfire as soon as we have the chance to get it. Furthermore, be sure to pick up Point Blank as soon as possible for the huge DPS increase, and prioritize getting these life and mana leech nodes soon after. In the mid-game, we'll be picking up more life and endurance charges, with high priority being given to Iron Grip, Elemental Overload, and temporarily Avatar of Fire. We'll only be picking up Avatar of Fire directly until we get Zoth's Blood, at which time you can reallocate those 3 points elsewhere. And finally, in the endgame tree, we'll be picking up a ton of additional life, defense, and our jewel sockets. And with all of that covered, let's talk about the leveling gems. Fortunately, this one is incredibly straightforward, as both Molten Strike and Leap Slam are available from very early in the game, with Molten Strike being made available to you after reaching the first town. It can very cleanly be scaled from the moment you get it all the way into the deepest endgame. The build in general can be developed very naturally, slowly fitting in the recommended pieces as they become available to you. As far as leveling gear goes, if this is your very first character or first character of the league, I would most highly recommend simply using the items that you find in game, and if you get a few chaos drops, maybe pick up 1 or 2 of the recommended cheap leveling items. For anyone else not on their first character, I recommend the usual suspects. For cheap, you can pick up Gold Rim, Loctonial Caress, Wanderlust, Duresso's Salute, Prism Weave, and Wise Oak, using the cheap Tabula Rasa as your 6th link, and the cheap Thief's Torment Prismatic Ring to shore up some resistances and fix all of your mana issues. I also recommend getting a couple of Quicksilver Flasks, a Sulfur, Granite, and a good Life Flask as well. As far as weapons go, I recommend dual wielding something cheap, like the Princess early on, until you reach level 28 and you can dual wield the best named weapon in the game, Brutus's Lead Sprinkler. These can be scaled pretty comfortably until you can equip your 2 Nebulocs. With the leveling gear sorted, I think that finally covers everything. This Molten Strike Nebuloc Juggernaut has achieved a level of tankiness that I've never experienced before. I'm confident that the build is more than capable of taking down all the content that Metamorph and Conquerors of the Atlas have to offer, slaughtering all of the Guardian Elder Slayers, countless T16 fully juiced Metamorphs, and Shaper himself without breaking a sweat. And in my first and only fight against Sirus in my limited playtime, I was able to take him below 20% health on my very first life, before suffering a single death due to not knowing the later mechanics of the fight. A storm then proceeded to block the entrance to the arena, causing me to suffer instantaneous death upon entering the area for my next 5 lives, which was of course a wonderful and not infuriating experience. I have no doubt that with even reasonable investment in some minor fight knowledge, he can be comfortably taken down by this build. I want to give a huge thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. With your backing, the dream of making content creation a full-time job is slowly becoming a real possibility. Special recognition goes to Zolaris, Daniel Wig, Chris Sherrick, David Lacamy, Vangshire, Bloody, Anlei Huang Bao, Efren Valladares, and Eric Meyer. Thank you to each of you for your dedicated support of the channel. It's truly appreciated. If you would like to be credited at the end of each of my videos, or join our Discord community for Path of Exile and channel discussion, consider checking out the Patreon link in the description below. And finally, if you've made it this far, thank you for watching. I hope the video has proved helpful. If you have any questions, leave them down below and I'll do my best to answer. Consider subscribing for more build guides just like this one. And as always, I've been SRO, and I will see you guys in the next video.